Welcome to episode 7 of Travelling Science. G'day legends, welcome back to Travelling Science, the podcast that's sharing science with the world. My name's Jesse Crow and I'm the Travelling Scientist, coming to you today from Brisbane in Australia. I'm a health science communicator, and on this show we interview doctors, researchers and experts, hearing their stories and sharing their ideas that can help us to live a smarter, happier and healthier life. Today's guest is Professor Andy Pitman, and he is the Director of the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes, with over 35 years' experience working in climate science. Andy is a climate modeller, and he's done so much research and writing on this topic. This guy knows exactly how our world works and where we're headed. It was like speaking with a futurist. And he has the perfect balance of enthusiasm. He's not a pessimist saying we're all screwed, but he's also not an optimist. He simply states the facts and says, here's what needs to happen as soon as possible. During our conversation, Professor Andy Pitman answers questions like, are electric cars the future? Why transitioning to renewable energies is difficult? Should we all go vegan? Does biofuel work? What's wrong with carbon offsets? And is it too late? And we also discuss topics like carbon capture, greenwashing, battery technology, deforestation, comparing carbon emissions to eating McDonald's, and the most impactful thing that you can do as an individual to prevent climate change. But before the interview, I'd just like to share a quick review of the podcast with you. And this week's review comes from I'm a fan of, calling Travelling Science a great find. They say, this podcast is an upbeat and interesting way of talking about big subjects. It's like an accessible way of dipping your toe in the science waters when you don't know how to swim. Well, I'm a fan of. Cheers, legend. Thank you so much. You've actually just made my day. I love talking about the big subjects. And I'm glad that I can help you dip your toe in the science pool because, here's a little secret, I can't swim either. But let's learn together, hey? So thanks again for that review, and if you're listening and you want to support this show, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts is a great zero-cost way to do that. It really helps other people to find the show, and I could be reading out your review on next week's episode. Alright, let's do it. Here is this week's interview talking all about climate change with the one, the only, Professor Andy Pitman. Professor Andy Pitman, welcome to Travelling Science.
My pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for taking the time to come and chat with us. Maybe just to get started, would you be able to tell us exactly what did you study at university?
I did an undergraduate degree in physical geography at Liverpool University. Then I did a PhD in modelling the terrestrial surface, so how energy, water and carbon flow through the atmosphere into the land and from the land back into the atmosphere, which is part of climate science.
Wow. So I might move on to a very simple, broad, overarching question. Where are we at with climate change? Like, what are the stakes and how are we faring as a global population?
That's a really difficult question to answer. The scientists were pretty clear on the risks around climate change in about 1990 and really clear in 1995.
So I had a look, and in 1995, that's 28 years ago, the International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, pointed out that burning fossil fuels, agriculture and other human activities were greatly increasing the amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which hold in heat and basically warm up the planet. And they pretty much said that if we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to get hotter, sea levels will rise, and we're all either going to die from fires or floods. Well, those weren't their exact words, but something along those lines. And that was 28 years ago.
And it's a long time since 1995. And despite the fact that scientists were saying we needed to reduce emissions back in 1995, we have continued to increase emissions. So in a sense, we've wasted a very long time period. And now the rubber's hitting the road in terms of climate change. And it's hard to turn the Titanic around as it steams towards the iceberg. So I'm certainly not amongst those scientists who think there's a full-scale existential risk to humanity by the end of next week. Nor am I one of those scientists who think there's nothing to see here, it's not a drama. I think it's a really serious problem. It's a more serious problem than it would have been had society listened to scientists back in 1995. Certainly, a lot of consequences are not avoidable now, but the worst case scenario is avoidable. It's still within humans' control to limit warming to around 2 degrees. Your listeners will have heard a lot about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, but I don't think that's possible now. It's too late. But 2 degrees is still in play, and that would certainly stop some of the worst consequences of climate change.
Okay, so we definitely are not moving fast enough. We haven't been acting fast enough, and now is really, as much as ever, is a time when we really need to be taking action. We need to be doing more, essentially.
Yes, and we've known that for a very long time.
Do you have any suspicions as to why action isn't being taken? Do people just not believe the science? Are there too many big greedy corporations out there that just ignoring the suggestions? What's the problem?
Well, look, it's difficult, right? In other fields, it's true as well. In health sciences, we know that Coca-Cola and McDonald's are not part of a long-term healthy diet, but people still eat them. We know that CO2 is not part of a long-term healthy planetary diet, but it's an invisible trace gas. People don't see it. If it was a dense, colourful gas, it would never have got to this problem. Things we cannot see, we don't rationalise in the same way as if we can see it. And it's an interesting psychology. And indeed, one of the areas that climate science is now engaging with much more actively are psychologists, because they actually understand how decision-making is made. There's clearly a misinformation campaign from some in the fossil fuel industry that goes back to the 1960s. They didn't want their business models to collapse, which is not exactly surprising.
So there is a lot of psychology that explains why it's so gosh darn hard to stop digging up million-year-old plants and using them to light up our houses and fuel our cars. It's complicated, but for now, let's answer some important questions, like how the heck are we all going to get around in the future? I'm hoping for the next short while to talk about a few key areas, and if you can offer any opinions or information on those, that would be incredible. The first one I was wanting to talk about is transportation, and I guess I would start that conversation by asking, do you think electric vehicles are the future?
Yes. There was a science fiction story written a very, very long time ago, which I don't recall the name of, but it talked about looking back in time and kids being completely perplexed that oil was being used in vehicles and you were burning oil.
I tried to find this book online, but I couldn't. But I did find some other similar books, like The Gods Themselves by Isaac Asimov, which is a story about Earth in the 22nd century where we have limitless energy which we extract from the sun, but then we take so much of it that we nearly end up destroying the sun. Or there's a book called Empty by Susan Wayne, which looks at what the world might be like when we run out of fossil fuels in the very, very near future. Even the Mad Max movies are set in a world where we've essentially run out of oil. And I, for one, would not want to live in that dystopian wasteland run by a weird heavy metal Darth Vader guy.
Because, of course, oil is a very valuable commodity for other things, ranging from plastics to pharmaceuticals. And just burning it is a bizarre thing to do with a valuable commodity. And we have a replacement now with electric. I'm not saying electric vehicles are perfect in every conceivable way, but they are clearly as important an advance as the tractor was when people used horses to pull ploughs. And when electric cars are properly integrated into the energy grid, that is, you will use your car battery to fuel your home and then recharge your car battery with renewables, it's going to make a massive difference to how we source energy in our society. So absolutely, cars will go electric, as will most other things, and sooner rather than later would be good. Really, one needs to bring the cost of electric vehicles down so you feel financially burdened when you try to buy a non-electric car.
Yes, so financial incentives to encourage people to be buying the right vehicles, the electric vehicles.
I turn it around the other way. nobody prices pollution. Your car, if it's a petrol-driven or diesel, worst case, driven vehicle, has a cost to the environment, a not insignificant cost. If that was properly charged for, then electric cars would be a lot more cost-effective.
I guess my biggest question or concern is seeing the amount of cars that are on the road right now. How would we possibly make a switch? It needs to happen soon. It needs to happen as soon as possible. So how do we get rid of all of the fuel, diesel, petrol vehicles that are on the roads right now and get electric vehicles being the main vehicles?
Well, it's going to happen anyway, because most of the major car manufacturers are weaning themselves off the internal combustion engine. So it really doesn't matter what you or I might think, or indeed what governments might think. You're not going to be able to buy a petrol-driven car in the future. Now, how long that future is an interesting question. And there are better experts in that area than me. But I think there'll be quite a lot of people wondering whether they'll ever buy a petrol car again. If you've just bought a new petrol car and you're going to keep it for 5 years, it'll be interesting to know whether that's the last one you ever buy.
Absolutely. I certainly hope that they phase out over the next few years and the electric vehicles do grow and the infrastructure will come along with that, hopefully, and it's a seamless transition. And one other question, what do you drive?
I drive a Toyota Corolla hybrid, and I get about 4 litres per 100 kilometres. But it's not an electric car. But it's one small step from a modern hybrid to an electric car, and probably my next car will be electric.
One major issue that many electric vehicle deniers often point out is that the batteries require precious metals that need to be mined out of the ground, just like coal and oil. So why even bother? Well, let me give you 3 quick responses to this argument. 1, we can recycle precious metals so they won't run out. We can't recycle coal or oil. They will run out. 2, even the mining process can be done with electric vehicles, reducing its impact on climate change. And 3, battery technology is always improving. Soon they will be cheaper, more efficient, and require less precious metals anyway. So stop looking for excuses to hold on to your gas-guzzling Ford, and just accept that your next car is probably going to be electric, and you're probably going to love it. Fantastic. Okay, as well as transportation, another area that I was hoping to talk a bit about is electricity, and how I suppose I would start that conversation is with perhaps another obvious question. Do you think renewables are the future?
Yes. So bar cost, there are no issues really with renewables now. You can create in Australia a connected grid of renewables with things like pumped hydro and battery that would supply all of Australia's energy demands. It's just a question of cost and time. That's almost not the question anymore, although it is a legitimate question, but the really interesting question is what Australia does with its oil, its gas, and its coal when we don't need it. Because what one should do is leave it in the ground. What we probably will try and do is export it according to a range of pretty dodgy rationale around how we're helping the developing world develop. But we're not really. If you look at what's going on at the moment over India with extreme heat, I'm not sure that's a good news story for the Indians that they're pumping out more CO2 because we're exporting it to them. So it'll be very interesting. Probably 25 years ago, I was part of a group that briefed federal cabinet saying you had to go renewable so that when the fossil fuel industries in Australia were non-viable, it didn't matter. In other words, the Australian economy was in no way dependent on exports of fossil fuels. That never happened. And so now we have a real challenge where we have to transition our own energy to renewables at the same time as we should stop exporting those things. And unfortunately, if we stop exporting those things, there's a massive economic hit. And it's not clear how to fund all of the things that matter to us. It's absolutely true that if we stop exporting fossil fuels, the Australian economy is very badly affected, because governments haven't put policies in place over the last 25 years. And so the fault lies with a lack of action and a lack of vision in the federal governments, plural, and they've left us now in a very awkward position where we have to stop exporting fossil fuels, but we can't afford to.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Well, my next question was going to be, why are we still building coal mines and gas plants? But I suppose that's so even if we're not using it, even if Australia can transition to majority or completely renewable energies, we're still digging up those fossil fuels and just exporting them elsewhere for economic gain. It's like one of those complex things. Not sure how we solve that sort of problem.
So the idea would have been that you continue to export energy, but you export energy in the form of renewable energy. And there are efforts to, for instance, connect Australia to Indonesia, I think. And also hydrogen is an export opportunity. But we've been very slow in getting to a position of being able to do that.
What do you think about hydrogen as a source of fuel?
Don't know a great deal about it. A lot of people are putting a lot of money into it. Therefore, I suspect they've done a business case to look at the value proposition.
So hydrogen is the most abundant element in the whole dang universe. Conveniently, it's also a potential source of clean energy because hydrogen, H, reacts with oxygen, O, and creates H2O, also known as water. And it also creates thermal energy as well, which can be used to power stuff. The difficult part is getting pure hydrogen in the first place. That in itself requires energy. I guess you got to spend energy to make energy.
I'm not sure how necessary it is. I'm not being negative about it. I think time will tell as to whether hydrogen is a long-term solution to the energy export situation. I don't really see why you need to use it in Australia, but you might use it as a means for export.
Would you say that most of the world could probably run purely on renewables like wind power, solar power, hydropower? That would be enough.
Yeah. Well, it is eye-wateringly expensive to build the infrastructure to allow all countries to be completely energy independent of fossil fuels. You imagine trying to do that in some countries would be really challenging. I think there's enough energy density in both wind and solar and other sources, geothermal, wave, etc., that basically the planet could go net zero, but it will take quite a long time and it will cost a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to do it quick. We need more investment in those areas.
We needed to have started 30 years ago and we didn't.
Right. But it's not too late.
Well, it depends what you mean by it's not too late. It is too late to avoid the 1.5 degrees of warming that is clearly an existential risk to some Pacific islands and to some other regions. So one of the realities here is the lack of action by carbon-intensive economies around the world has in effect sacrificed some countries.
It is bizarre to think that some island nations might soon cease to exist. Countries like Fiji, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Micronesia, and the Solomon Islands are slowly but surely losing their low-lying lands to the rising sea levels. Imagine if one day the ocean was just up in your house. You're trying to make your morning coffee and salt water is just lapping around your ankles. You try to put on your shoes, but they're already wet. You try to watch your television, but guess what? It floated away while you were sleeping. Pretty annoying, huh? Well, this is actually what's happening to some people. Maybe not that exact scenario, but something like that. And we need to make some changes before more people lose their homes to rising sea levels.
And that's pretty outrageous. But not very many countries, which I'm not putting a value on, I'm just asserting that at 1.5 degrees, Australia doesn't become uninhabitable, or the US doesn't become uninhabitable. And we can avoid 2 degrees by very, very deep cuts in emissions implemented very quickly.
As well as transportation and electricity, another area that I wanted to discuss briefly is agriculture. And I suppose my first question there is, do you think that people's food choices have a big influence on climate change?
They have an influence. There's plenty of evidence that reducing meat in your diet and increasing more of a vegetarian diet is net beneficial to greenhouse gas emissions. And before you ask, no, I'm not a vegetarian.
How did he know I was going to ask that? This guy is a genius. And I don't judge people on what they choose to eat, but if you really want to reduce your carbon footprint, listen to this. People listening in might be thinking, oh, what can I do in some way? Perhaps if I was a vegetarian or a vegan, I could do my part for climate change.
That's an easy question to answer. If you want the first order answer to the question, what can you as an individual do for climate change? The answer is carefully reread your superannuation documentation and move all your superannuation into a genuinely environmentally sustainable fund. And if everybody did that, it would have much more impact on Australian emissions, investment in renewables and so on, than everybody going vegetarian.
Your superannuation in Australia is similar to your individual retirement account, or IRA, in USA. Basically, if the government takes a percentage of your income and invests it for your retirement, you need to make sure that it is invested in renewable and sustainable companies, not the coal mining and oil industries, which is where most people's super is currently invested, and that adds up to billions, if not trillions of dollars. But switching your super is super quick. It takes like 15 minutes, I just did it myself. And this has got to be not only the most effective, but also the easiest thing that you can do to help reduce climate change and save those drowning islands. So what are you waiting for? Do it today.
But you've got to be very, very careful. I'm sure you've all heard of greenwashing.
Greenwashing is when companies claim to be doing good things for the environment when they're actually not. For example, the Eco Hummer, recyclable coffee pods, or low-emission international flights. These things all sound nice, but they're not real. It's just greenwashing. Anyway, now you know what greenwashing is, let's get back to talking about your super.
There is a superannuation company advertising on TV at the moment that says we've ceased investment in fossil fuels in Australia. Well, that's weasel words for we've moved our investment from Australia to fossil fuels in other places. I mean, that doesn't help, right? Working out how environmentally sustainable a superannuation fund is extraordinarily hard. And you actually got to get right down and understand stuff that's almost impossible to work out. There is no legitimate ranking of superannuation schemes for genuine above-board environmental sustainability. But you can do a lot by first-order assessment of how your super is invested and divert it to a more environmentally sustainable fund.
That is a really great tip. Thank you so much. I love that. Another topic that I wanted to touch on was our forests and looking at things like deforestation and reforestation. Are these important factors toward climate change?
So, first of all, when you chop down a forest, you emit carbon. Deforestation cannot occur without emitting carbon. How much carbon is emitted depending on what you do with the timber. So if you use the timber, for instance, for building houses, that carbon gets moved from a landscape into timber for construction, and it gets stored in that house for however long that house exists. If you then replant a forest on that same location, you might well offset the carbon that's been released by the deforestation, because you needed trucks burning diesel to do the deforestation, you needed to mill the timber, there's wastage that might be burned or wood chipped. But you probably can run forestry commercially as a temporary CO2 sink. But the problem is that house doesn't stay a house forever. Carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere stays in the atmosphere for order a century. So it's actually extremely hard to use landscapes as a net carbon sink. There are ways to do it. For example, replanting forests that have been cut down and leaving them permanently, not for 30 years, but permanently. So it is perfectly legitimate as a carbon sink to take an area that's been deforested, replant the forests, ideally with native timbers, and leave them. That's a tick. But it isn't a tick if you cut them down after 30 years. That's a cross.
Which a lot of big companies are doing. I know I had friends that did tree planting over in Canada, and they spent a whole season planting trees, and you think, oh, this is great for the environment. But that's run by the company that in 20, 30 years' time is going to come through and chop them all down for the timber.
Yeah, and that isn't going to work. It might buy the planet a little tiny bit of time, but it really isn't helpful. And it's one of those areas of greenwashing where you might try to buy an offset to offset your CO2 emissions. And if you're buying an offset that's a forestry, and that forestry is planting trees to harvest them, that's not actually offsetting your CO2 emissions on the longer term. The second thing about deforestation is most deforestation around the world has been for agriculture. So you chop a forest down and you then grow crops. Well, that's quite important to feed people. That's fine. But some of it is for palm oil or other cash crops that really are of marginal benefit to humans. So in terms of climate change, rule 1, stop deforestation. Rule 2 is replant where you've deforested and leave it permanently. And rule 3 is almost anything else is not a net benefit.
It sounds so simple, but I guess as with a lot of these issues, there's a lot more complication in there. I know you mentioned before how when carbon is released into the atmosphere, it's there for centuries. What about a method like carbon capture? Is that effective? And if so, why don't we do it on a massive scale to sort of counter some of the damage we've already done? I should probably explain what carbon capture is. Basically, instead of releasing carbon dioxide from big industries, we can capture it, compress it, and bury it deep underground instead of letting it out into the atmosphere. Does it work? Well, I'll let the professor explain.
So, carbon capture from the atmosphere is possible. It is very expensive, but it's possible. And carbon capture and storage works at small scales, but no one has figured out a way to ramp it up to the scales you need. Humans are currently emitting, let's say, 10 billion tons of carbon a year. 10 billion tons, which is a really big number, right?
Yeah, that's huge.
Rule of thumb, 1 billion tons is a cubic kilometre of coal. So now imagine that every year we're emitting a cubic kilometre of coal into the atmosphere. Somehow, just to keep the current CO2 level, you have to suck out 10 billion tons of this stuff and somehow stick it back underground. Well, actually, there's a simpler solution, much simpler, which is don't emit it in the first place. So we have the technology that's robust and reliable to not emit the carbon, and we have another technology that probably doesn't work at scale and is very, very expensive to take it back out the atmosphere and put it back down deep in the earth, and that probably doesn't work, and it's very expensive. So why not just go with a simple solution and not emit it in the first place? Now, I know that sounds trivial, but yeah, it's a much simpler solution. I'm not aware of any large scale, and I mean large scale, carbon capture and storage technology that's proven. And I actually suspect it's not always, but sometimes an excuse by the fossil fuel industry to claim that they have technologies that might, in the long term, allow them to continue burning coal. And the short answer is you can't keep burning coal.
Absolutely. We talked about carbon capture, and you mentioned briefly carbon offsets and when they do, and more often than not, do not work. But can carbon offsets work in certain scenarios?
Right. So there is a huge mythology around carbon offsets. If you dramatically reduce emissions down towards zero and you get close to zero, then offsets are a legitimate way to deal with that little bit that you can't cut. What a lot of companies are doing is arguing that they're working towards net zero primarily via offsets. And that is greenwashing and fabrication in the context of the climate. because you cannot offset all the emissions. One way of offsetting is to replant forests. I haven't done the math of the area that you'd have to plant each year and every year forever to fully offset emissions at 10 billion tonnes a year, but it wouldn't take very long to cover the entire planet in forests, and then what you're going to do?
I was about to say it's probably all of the viable land that we have.
And that viable land is quite important for growing crops. So the short story is, if you work for somebody who is claiming to be green by buying offsets, they are being seriously disingenuous.
Liars.
If you're working for someone who's cutting emissions dramatically and also buying offsets, that's probably quite legitimate.
Yeah, I think carbon offsets is kind of like a scapegoat, and big companies in industry, what they really need to be doing is working out different ways of doing things that involve releasing less carbon emissions in the first place.
Yes, exactly.
Finally, looking to something like 2050, and as you've said, we're probably not going to be able to reduce it down to a 1.5 degree increase, but perhaps a 2 degrees Celsius increase by 2050 if we can achieve net zero. How are we faring with that?
So first of all, it's not 2 degrees by 2050. So let's talk about emission reductions first. If you get to net zero globally by 2050, you'll still exceed 2 degrees, but not by very much, I suspect. There's a lot of uncertainty in the precise numbers, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. To get to 1.5, you've kind of got to go net zero by 2035 globally. And I can't see how that's feasible or viable.
No, that's not much time.
No, it's just not going to happen. Really, what we're talking about is a reduction in emissions that's very deep and very dramatic and sustained, that slows the rate of warming, that lets lots of other options come into play, like offsets, like carbon capture and storage for small amounts, and other technologies that leads you to overshoot the 2 degrees, but not by very much. And then that sustained strategy about zero emissions, net zero emissions, and some removal of CO2 from the atmosphere lets you drop down reasonably quickly from the 2 degrees down to below the 2 degrees. That's the strategy.
Awesome. I like that. I've got a few listener questions for you in just a moment, Andy. But first, every week here on Travelling Science, we make a donation to a charity of the guest's choosing. And this week, Professor Andy Pitman has chosen to donate to Rainforest Rescue, a foundation that focuses on planting and protecting rainforests as well as preserving their wildlife. And this charity is great for reducing humans' effects on climate change. So a donation has been made to Rainforest Rescue on behalf of Professor Andy Pitman, and if you'd like to make a donation to that charity as well, or if you'd like to support this show and the charities that we donate to every single week, you can certainly do that as well, and both of the links are in the description just below. Now, on to the listener questions. The first one comes from Pigeon Shepherd, who wanted to ask, and you might have already covered this, if we can make positive changes as individuals or whether we need to be targeting legislation.
As an individual, I've already talked about what you can do with your superannuation. That changes the flow of capital through the economic system and can have quite an impact. That's the first thing. The second thing you can do is you can switch from your diesel burning Mustang to a hybrid or electric vehicle. Solar panels on your roof help. Good insulation in your home helps. Obviously, it's a better carbon footprint to be using public transport than driving, and it's a better to be cycling or walking rather than using public transport. But there's limits to what people can do, right? If you're really pushing, you could go vegetarian. But honestly, these have little effect. They're not a negative thing to do, and they're not trivial. So please don't think I'm saying individuals can't help. But the things that actually matter are large numbers of people heading in a similar direction that changes policy. So you certainly can talk to your local politicians about their actions, but targeting superannuation, targeting companies that actually have good environmental policies and avoiding companies that are greenwashing and avoiding companies that don't even bother to greenwash are useful things individuals can do.
Charlie B wanted to know, he was asking specifically about biofuels and if they might be a viable alternative to gasoline and petrol.
Depends how the biofuel is produced. In some parts of the world, and I don't think this is true of Australia, but I'm not the expert, in some parts of the world, forests have been cleared to grow materials to underpin biofuel, and that's bad. If you're using E10 fuels in Australia, which has got 10% ethanol, and that ethanol is sourced from things that would otherwise be wasted, or the ethanol is coming from a manufacturing process as a byproduct, this is probably good, but not as good as moving to an electric car, which doesn't use biofuels at all.
Yes. So biofuels, possibly okay, but electric vehicles, probably the right way to go. Or hybrids at this stage.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that one. The lovely Jubbly wanted to ask, basically, is it possible for us to stop climate change?
No, but with respect, it's the wrong question. You will have heard wackos routinely on TV and radio saying, but the climate's always changed. Well, yes, duh. We know the climate's always changed. It changes naturally on long time scales, typically, and it also changes year by year as an El Nino or a La Nina comes in, or a whole range of really interesting things. So we know climate changes naturally, and no, you can't stop that process unless you can stop the wobble of the Earth relative to the sun and a whole range of other cool things. So you can't stop climate change. That is different from asking the question, can you stop anthropogenic warming? That is the elements of climate change due to human activity. Yes, you can stop that. We're not showing a great deal of evidence that we have the willingness to stop it, but it is technically possible to stop it by stopping the emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
True. Good to know. And Cassie Apple asked the question, is it too late?
No, it's too late to avoid 1.5 degrees. And if you live in some Pacific islands, that I'm afraid is not a good news story. There are many things that we can no longer stop. There will be climate-induced extinctions, and we can't stop those because there's an inertia in the climate system. And that is, if you stopped emitting CO2 today, you would still see further warming as the climate equilibrated. So there's stuff we cannot stop now. I've said publicly, if you've never gone and scuba dived on the Barrier Reef, you should pull your finger out and do it reasonably soon, because the heat waves associated with the next El Nino will cause a lot more bleaching, and the bleaching events are occurring too quickly for proper recovery. So you might deeply care about the biodiversity on the Barrier Reef. You might deeply care about particular animals and plants, but some of those are gone. They're not gone yet, but they're gone, and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's confronting, but we need to recognize that. That said, there's other things that are not gone, and there are things that we can, by limiting warming, protect and give a long-term future to. And that's why limiting warming to 2 degrees is far better than not limiting warming to 2 degrees. There's a phrase that's been coined that every 1/10 of a degree matters. So don't think about 1.5 or 2, think about 1/10 of a degree. You save lots of stuff if you limit warming to 2.0 relative to 2.1. So it is important that we act and act really fast, but also there are consequences. If you've been eating a really, really bad diet and smoking for 25 years, you might switch that and you will benefit from it. But all the consequences are still there to some degree in your body. You haven't wiped the slate clean. And it's a little bit like with climate. Whatever we do from here on in is good, but it would have been better if we'd started in 1990.
Right. So might be too late for some things, but overall, it's not too late for us, and we need to take action as soon as possible in many ways.
Correct.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for answering those listener questions. I've just got a lightning round with a few more quick questions for you, Andy, and then we can finish up if you're ready for the lightning round.
I am.
Alrighty. Which country do you think is doing the least for climate change right now?
Many developing countries aren't dealing with climate change well because they have other immediate priorities.
Fair enough. Which country do you think is doing the most for climate change right now?
A number of European countries are well on the way to net zero.
Fantastic. What do you think is the best thing? Well, you've already answered. What the best thing an individual can do towards climate change is? That probably changing their superannuation?
Yep.
What do you think is the worst thing that an individual could be doing to promote climate change?
Being public in scientifically ill-informed denialist arguments that they would be able to fix if they bothered to read a little bit.
Right, so spreading the wrong message.
Yes.
If you had $1 billion to put towards climate change, what would you do with it? Where would you send that funding?
So I'm a modeler, and our modeling technologies are not as good as they need to be to inform adaptation. I'd invest in the next generation of prediction tools that let us inform people on what they need to adapt to and when they need to adapt to it.
Oh, fantastic. It's a bit of a different one. If you'd never studied climate science, what do you think you might have done with your life?
I was very interested in catastrophe theory relating to geomorphology.
Wow. So what would you be doing then?
Probably unemployed. I'm very interested in how very big events change the landscape that we see around us, which is a very Northern Hemisphere thingy because we haven't had those sorts of really big events. But if you walk through the Blue Mountains, for instance, inland of Sydney, there's these immense valleys. And thinking about what must have cut those valleys and in what circumstances is very interesting, I think.
That sounds super cool. What is the best part of your job?
Dealing with graduate students.
Awesome. Or what's the worst part of your job?
Bureaucracy.
Okay. I thought you might have also said dealing with graduate students.
No, our grad students are the best and brightest kids of their generation, and they are so awesome that even when they think they're hustling me, they're keeping me on my toes. And I value our graduate students. And if I make a plug, it's outrageous that graduate students are funded below the poverty line in terms of scholarships. Absolutely.
Well, shout out to the graduate students. You're doing great things and keep it up. Thank you so much for being here today and speaking with us all about climate change. I feel like a lot of people have learned a lot, gotten a better understanding of how we're faring and what needs to happen next. And I want to thank you so much for all the incredible work that you've done and continue to do in this area. I do have one more question just to finish out on. If you had one last bit of advice you'd like to share with our listeners today, something that they could take home and act on to improve their lives or improve on the environment and climate change in some way, what would your best bit of advice be?
So I've touched on it already. In order, check your superannuation policy. Check how you use energy at home in terms of all of your energy footprint and electrify it to the degree you can. And write to your local MP and ask what they're doing to help solve something that is a real material risk to up-and-coming generations. And don't accept the bland trash that you get back from some local members.
So there you have it, legends. That was Professor Andy Pitman talking all about climate change and the future of our civilization. And I really appreciated some of his metaphors, like how he compared carbon emissions to eating unhealthy foods. We know it's bad, but we still do it anyway, and I think we can all relate to that. The difference is when you're eating unhealthy foods, it's bad for you. But when you're polluting the planet, it's bad for all of us. And I think we all need to make some changes and work together to slow down the heating up of the planet before it's too late. And as Andy suggested, the most impactful thing that we can do as individuals to help with climate change is to check and change our superannuation. Make sure that your life savings are being invested in companies that are sustainable and renewable, not the big fossil fuel companies. And you might be afraid to change your super. You might think that those fossil fuel companies are bigger and therefore better investments. But I would question that. See, Professor Pitman, the expert on this matter, just clearly stated that this change is inevitable. The usage of fossil fuels cannot continue for much longer, and green energy companies are the future. They will continue to grow, and when you support them by changing your super, your investments will grow along with them. Also, this is not financial advice, and I'm not a financial advisor, but I'm just saying that this is the number one most impactful thing that you could do to help climate change is to change your super. And another final thing that the professor suggested was to write a letter to your local member of parliament. And I think that's a great idea. Any little thing that you can do to help with climate change is great. But at the end of the day, we need to make big changes. And the best way to do that is through political action, which sucks, I know, but apparently that's how our world works nowadays. So write a letter to somebody important and tell them what needs to change. And as Andy said, don't accept any of the bland trash that you get back from them. Keep hassling them to start making some changes, and you will be helping to make a huge difference to save the planet. Anyway, that's all for today, legends. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more Travelling Science every single week. And for shorter science-based content, subscribe to Travelling Scientist on YouTube or check out Travelling Science on Instagram and TikTok as well. Finally, if you stick around to the end, I always leave you with a little secret. And this week's secret is that I love Frenchies. The people are good, but I'm talking about the dogs, French bulldogs. They're small and chubby, and they're usually wearing some sort of miniature clothing, which is just adorable. And I know they struggle to breathe, and they snore louder than most humans, and that they can only walk for a couple hundred meters before they become completely exhausted. But damn it, I still love them. So shout out to Lola and Remy and all the French bulldogs out there. You pups rock. Alright, thanks again for listening, legends. Go write that letter, check your superannuation, and I'll catch you next Science Sunday. Cheers.